Thank you so much. What a gorgeous and moving film.
Thank you.
And it's I don't know how many times I've watched it now, but it feels different. But although I will say, the most immediate thing that struck me watching it now is just how timely, of course, unfortunately timely it is, and even the idea that an ICE agent would be masked, which I think when I first saw this just seemed like, well, this is like clearly fabricated. Watching it now feels entirely plausible. So I guess maybe that would be my first question or invitation to you, is just to think about what is it like to screen this film now, 7 years after it's been made, but in a context that is even more grim and violent and frightening.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a surreal feeling, actually. And, when I was making this film, my films tend to be set in milieus that are very, they're grounded and rooted in actual political and socioeconomic reality, and at also very particular historical moments, in this one being the first Trump administration. And I was thinking I was just making some kind of time capsule, like a portrait of that particular moment. And I never once really thought that it would continue to be resonant and relevant, in a way even more so today, and that 2 administrations later, it feels like the situation is not only the same but perhaps even grimmer and worse.
I mean, it strikes me that this is a film, it's such a New York film, and pretty much everyone we encounter is an immigrant or a newly arrived person, or maybe a generation removed. I'm interested in the way that you are layering those different experiences between Olivia and Alex, especially, and the different ways that they wear outsiderness, misfitting within their families or their communities, and like, how did you think about sort of putting those two similar but like different in terms of maybe degree or outsiderness? Can you speak to that?
Yes, certainly. I think I also had Olga, the grandmother, in mind. I wanted to make a film in New York City that was fundamentally a film about immigrants, immigrant love story. I mean, most obvious being Olivia as a first-generation immigrant who happens to be undocumented. Olga, who it's not directly, addressed or stated in the film, but I would imagine she had immigrated 50 years prior. And Alex, therefore, is a third-generation immigrant, and they're all 3 of them are displaced in different ways. Olivia is the most obvious one because of their political situation. Olga's displacement, since she's dealing with her dementia, is more psychological. And Alex, I think his pursuit to becoming a mature, man and human being, but finds himself, socializing, fraternizing with, and growing up in a community that's not necessarily the most progressive and open-minded, and is trying to navigate that and find his humanity through it. So I think this is a story about people who are flawed but are trying to be the best person that they can be under the circumstances that they're dealt with.
I mean, I don't really see any of Olivia's flaws, but certainly Alex has come to mind. I think the first time I watched this, I think I told you, I was like, I just want them to get together. I like want him to like man up or whatever, and show up for her the way that he wishes he were, and that she is disappointed that he's not. But I'm having a different reaction watching it this time, and yeah, I think there's something to that's just more of a comment, actually. I'll leave it there. But I was interested in this idea that, Olivia does have this kind of detachment from her environment, and she encounters her mother and then Olga through the telephone first. Like, we kind of encounter her through the phone at the beginning and at the end of the film.
Yeah.
And there's a way she's sort of, it's not a flaw of hers, but she's kept at a kind of remove from others around her, especially those that she's caring for, which is almost everyone, right?
Yeah.
So can you speak more to maybe that kind of detachment? I think it's, I have my own ideas about it as well, but I would love to just hear you talk about that.
Yeah, interestingly enough, that aspect in the film about Olivia's conversations with her mom, primarily through, the phone, just a voice call, is also, I think, is lifted from my own phone calls with my mom. I mean, some of them are even in verbatim. Like that, like I would get phone calls from my mom at like 4:30 in the morning. Yeah, and in the same way, I feel like this idea of the disembodied voice that's not visible on screen, where you feel the presence of the person who's not, visible even more potently and more palpably, applies to Olivia's mother in this case, but also on the opposite end, kind of that spectrum is Trump. We just hear his voice. We never really see him, and I think that makes it even more, unsettling for that reason, and that the monster is scarier when you don't actually see it. And also in the final sequence, the final passages of the film, when we only hear Olivia, on the voiceover, kind of this disembodied voice haunting the final montage of the film in the winter. Yeah, that was an idea that I had, and that I feel like the decision to not show a particular character renders them more, powerfully.
Yeah, I mean, there's that one line that she gives when Alex is telling her, I'll take care of you, and she says, or you don't need to worry about anything now, I'm here, and she says, just because I don't worry doesn't mean that they go away. And you do such an amazing job evoking this feeling of being watched, of being, of this like spectral presence that is just always there and can see in the dark and in all these empty spaces. And yeah, can you speak a bit about the approach to the cinematography in the spaces? And that scene in particular, too, is such a remarkable scene because we're toggling between these like extra wide shots of her on the subway platform and then the intimate close-up of the two of them together. And it's like this, whiplash between these different kinds of spaces, the deeply intimate and the almost like impersonal, surveillant kind of gaze. And it's really, it's evocative and unsettling at the same time. So yeah, please say more about that.
The editor in me is like, yes. Yeah, I really want the juxtaposition of kind of the very intimate, private, space and realm that they're in with the broader, the wider reality of the outside world kind of impinging, on the private realm. I wanted to, cut between just the two of them being intimate and I guess reminding the audience and the viewer that this intimacy takes place in a fraught, bigger world. And when we decided to shoot that extreme wide shot, on the train platform that slowly pushes in, and then have essentially the pillow talk, the post-coital conversation come in, I thought that there was an interesting dissonance and tension between just the quiet, whispery intimacy of their conversation and the claustrophobia and the voyeuristic quality of the shot, implying that Olivia's being watched, that makes the conversation feel, I think, ominous and also mildly threatening. I think I like minding the tension between, an audio, the dialogue or the music, or just the audio aspect of it feeling a certain way, and the imagery conveying something that might be discordant or incongruous to that.
It also suggests within that intimate space, there is like the potential for something really scary, or for mistrust to enter into that space. It's like it cuts into the intimacy of that moment.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in that, kind of the dynamic that plays out, or the privileges and the powers that takes place between these characters in the broader world imposes itself and makes itself felt in this interpersonal, romantic, private sphere that they.
I was really struck by your opening remarks starting this screening about how it was 7 years since your prior film, and during that time you had transitioned, and you felt very, coming into the confidence of who you are as coming into the making of this film, coinciding. And it strikes me that Olivia, which of course is played by you, is very confident in who she is. There's no ambiguity or anything to her sense of herself, but there is a lot of secrecy because it's imposed externally, that for her to be who she is publicly, for her gender, for her undocumented status, is a risk.
Yeah.
And what is, I think, really one of the really interesting things about this film is that the way that those two forms of secrecy, or needing to be secret for survival reasons, dovetail with each other. And that's like if you have anything to say regarding the, not exactly a conflation, but that they kind of come together, and the way that Alex is made to carry both of those secrets for her, and it's too much for him, is really, really tragic, actually.
Yeah, I've said before that, this is not an autobiographical film. Like, Olivia and I are both, Filipina trans women immigrants living in Brooklyn, but, the similarities in there. I do not have or have not had a Russian Jewish slaughterhouse worker lover. Or not yet. at least. But it's still very much deeply personal. I think, when I had first transition, especially the first few years, yeah, it is a matter of, self-preservation and survival. But it's also, for me, I think, is a matter of pride. Like, it's not your business, I do not have to disclose, any of that, to anyone if I didn't want to, or if I didn't feel compelled to. So it's both those things in that it's, I think, both a matter of necessity for her, but it's also an assertion of her agency, to decide not to have to disclose it, which presents or introduces, an element of risk and danger as well. If when she's becoming involved, becoming intimately involved with someone who isn't initially aware that she's trans, as well. And yeah, that aspect of it feels, I think, true to my own experience. Yeah, and I think that was really the only approach, or the only way I could approach that character in the decision to go about that. Which, I don't know, does it seem naive or? Okay.
No, I think it's quite smart, actually, that it becomes, when he learns about her, like, it's all bundled together.
Yeah.
And when he decides that he needs to protect her in his, feeble way, he's trying, and and he's overdoing it. But it makes sense. It adds something to that desire on his part to rescue her in these ways.
That's also, made me realize that when I was, writing and, making this film, and given that decision and the subjectivity that suggests, is that I was really directing and making this film from the experience of someone like myself. I wasn't necessarily being, I was oblivious to how an audience that was cisgender or, not queer would, regard or see this character. I wasn't necessarily thinking of, should I make my character more, feel more threatened, or, feel more anxious and, feel more like a victim. That wasn't what I was thinking, really. And so, yeah, and I think that's also why this film doesn't feel familiar in terms of the tropes that we tend to associate, with films that center a transgender and undocumented immigrant protagonist. I was making this film in a very unself-conscious way in that sense, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think more than anything, it's a love story. It's a deeply felt film. I mean, watching it, I was noticing the references you make to other films, other filmmakers, and enjoying that, but also just also enjoying getting pulled into the rhythms of this gorgeous film. It's so pleasurable and sensual and so sad. I'm like, why is it so sad? But no, it's I really I think it's quite wonderful, and I would not call that naive at all, but rather really deft navigating of types of, political or issues of identity that are easily pigeonholed or have a particular approach, right, that we're already familiar with in different cinematic spaces, and you manage to cut a really unique path because it stays so focused on this complex and somewhat opaque and but deeply felt character.
Thank you.
Really wonderful. Does anyone in the audience have any questions?
Before that, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the very talented and wonderful Ivory Aquino, who plays Trixie in the film. I'm so happy you could join us.
Hi, so I'm just kind of wondering about like the film title, Lingua Franca, because universal language. So I just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about like the thought process behind naming the film.
Yeah, certainly. One part of it is I thought the title, sounds very like highbrow and sophisticated. But kidding aside, I wanted to choose a title that similar to how I chose a title for my second feature, Apparition Yesterday. It's fundamentally ironic in the sense that first, as a filmmaker, I feel like the more films I make, the more my relationship with dialogue, the spoken word, of the characters becomes more complicated and ambivalent in that the characters are not necessarily using their words in a straightforward or forthright way. They use their words to hide or obfuscate what they're really thinking and feeling. And for that reason, it's usually what they withhold, or decide not to say, or just the camera observing them in their moments of privacy when no one's looking. That's the most revelatory and the most honest about them. And in this particular instance, lingua franca, which is bridge language, as you said, English would have been that between, Alex and Olivia and Olga. But what is more, I think, telling is, as I said, the silences and the pauses and the things that are left unsaid between the characters.
Hey, I think we all really enjoyed the scene where Olivia and Alex are pretending to meet at the bar for the first time, and she says, "Hi, I'm Isabel." And so I thought it was interesting to hear you say that, you don't see a ton of similarities between yourself and the character of Olivia, in that you feel like you lead a very different life from her. So I was wondering why you decided to make that explicit connection between yourself and the character in that scene where, Olivia is just pretending to be Isabel.
To be honest, I wasn't planning on saying Isabel. It just happened in the moment. I think I decided to keep it in because I think that take felt particularly alive in some sense to me. Also, similar to that, there was the driving scene where Olivia and Alex are kind of flirting with each other and talking about, how does this line translate to this one? That was also an improvised scene as well, because, I feel like my films are so serious. But in person, I like to think I'm more, goofy and funnier. And so it was about finding those moments that felt unguarded and natural, and having that, having those moments come through in an otherwise quite somber film.
I'm going to jump in with another question, since this is your only American film. What was I guess my question is kind of, why didn't you come back, or why haven't you come back? But you've set most of your films in the Philippines, is that
Yes.
correct? Okay.
Yeah.
And shot them there. as well.
Yeah, it's so funny because, my first two features, for instance, I moved here almost 20 years ago, really. And then, but I made my first two features in the Philippines. I flew back to the Philippines to shoot my first two features, even though I was already living here, because for some reason, I don't necessarily plan on, where I'm going to set the films, the stories that come to me but I feel like my films are a way of psychoanalyzing and maybe exercising, the demons that I had growing up. And, even though I had been living here, the stories that would come up with for those two features still naturally take place in the Philippines. But with Lingua Franca, in a way, it felt because I was transitioning. In a way, I was dealing with America and New York City in particular as a new, strange, beguiling, mysterious place. Now that I was beginning to navigate it as a woman, and particularly a Filipino trans woman immigrant, and so that somehow became naturally my choice of setting a milieu for this third one. For Moonglow, my most recent feature, I went back to the Philippines. I think both as a matter of practicality, because I had been working on another feature, but then there was a strike, in Hollywood, the writer's strike and the actor's strike. And then I had a window where I could work on a personal project. And I feel like with my films so far, they've kind of been circling a noirish world and sensibility. So I decided I'd do a full-on classic noir, Moonglow. But early this year, I was actually, I'm very, very fortunate that 2 years ago, I became naturalized as a US citizen. But then I also found out last year that Spain has a special treaty with former colonies. And I'm like, sorry, we colonized you. Here's a citizenship. So it has a special treaty with countries like Mexico and the Philippines where, instead of 10 years, you can become, sorry, this is becoming such a long-winded answer. So I was thinking of, moving there part-time, at least to work towards becoming a citizen. It's so funny, though, that I'm trying to become a citizen in the countries that colonized the Philippines. Makes you think. But, coming back here, I decided to pause this meme thing, but coming back here, I also just realized that the US has become home for me. Living in Madrid, where I barely knew anyone. I had a few friends, but it was a totally different new country where I didn't know anyone. I didn't speak the language particularly fluently. And coming back home to the US, and I started writing again. The stories that emerged are now set in the US, interestingly enough. And I've since written 2 that are set specifically in New York, one in Queens, which is also the first neighborhood that I lived in, first borough that I lived in when I moved to New York almost 20 years ago.
Hello, thank you. Really enjoyed the film. I just really appreciate that this film was shot on location in New York. And you alluded, I believe, to it previously, but I really am curious about the juxtaposition and the contrast between the home and the outside streets of New York. I felt there was like a sort of safety to the home, but maybe like unease or unstable. And then I think New York is safer than a lot of people like to say, but also I really think you encapsulated the sort of danger felt, especially as reflective of the political climate at the time, of course, with immigration. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, if possible.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, when I was making this film, I was trying to approach it very intuitively in that I was filming it the way that it felt right to me in the moment I was cutting it. We were adding the sound design, and only after the fact, realizing that I was ultimately channeling and trying to distill my own subconscious feelings about this character and me, moving through New York at that time, and that, it is the domestic space, when you're enclosed within these four walls, especially in those first few months of, the Trump administration, that I was feeling most secure. And it was when you stepped outside that the threat became real and became more felt, and became present. And that exposure, making Olivia and making me feel also vulnerable. So it's fascinating to me in that these realizations and what you observe correctly, only become apparent after I make them. And even, like for example, I'd mentioned before that I've been very vocal and transparent about the influences that I had, the directors that have been very important in the development of my cinephilia and my sensibility as a filmmaker, but I wasn't necessarily consciously thinking about them while making the film. The one filmmaker that I had in mind, while I was, like, especially the opening and final sequence is an homage to News from Home by Chantal Ackerman. But when I was showing my friends a fine cut of the film with some music put in, they were like, oh, that reminds me of Wong Kar-wai, which is funny because I had never, I mean, I love Wong Kar-wai, of course, and in my first feature, Senorita, as I mentioned the other night, I explicitly told the musical score, I want you to make the score of this film sound exactly like In the Mood for Love. But for friends who are cinephiles and programmers and fellow filmmakers to point that out to me, like in this film, was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ackerman haunts this film a lot, but especially, so that opening and closing shots, but also the shots in the kitchen are like No Home Movie, and the way that Ackerman shoots her mother, her last film. And so it's haunted not only by those films, but her relationship to her mother and this feeling of being far away from one's home, and being very much alone. That's kind of like the cast, the cinematic or cinephilic reference that covers this film. But to the point about the exterior shots that you mentioned, I noticed that whenever Olivia is being shot and she's outside, there are numerous obstructions between the camera and your view of her. So there's car doors or just people walking on the street. It's very rarely like a clear shot all the way to. There's all these things put in our way, which again, like kind of cyclically summon the challenges, the disruptions that the obstacles she faces that are maybe invisible in some sense, but are felt. And even when Alex's friends come over and you see through the chair, there's even with that kind of alienating effect is brought into the home.
Yeah, I wanted to have represent these characters, depict these characters as not being in a vacuum. They are existing in a specific, world and reality. And this also kind of dovetails with the observation of what you pointed out earlier in cutting from the intimate, close up to the extreme wide and the train platform that acknowledges that reality and how they cannot be separate from it, ultimately.
Thank you so much for this gorgeous film, and I hope you all come back for the rest of the series. It's